Hello, my name is Bruce Andrews. Welcome to a reading of Evangeline, a tale of Arcady by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This particular reading is taken from the 1899 printing by Alex Grosset and Company, the Minnehaha edition, New York. Specifically, this book belonged to my grandmother. I hope you will enjoy listening to it as much as I enjoy reading it to you. Although the story of Evangeline is the product of Longfellow's superb imagination and marvelous storytelling ability, it is in actual fact built upon a historically accurate foundation. History records the forced population transfer of the Acadian people from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick between 1755 and 1763. The Acadians called it Le Grand Dérangement, while others have called it the Great Upheaval, the Deportation, or Expulsion. Today, if it were to happen, it would be called ethnic cleansing. How did the French population come to be there in the first place? French settlers came to Acadie in 1636 to settle the wilderness. They were farmers and cultivated the fertile soil and befriended the local Micmac Indians. As British tensions increased and the French struggled to maintain their own heritage, the territory was ceded to the British in 1713 by the Treaty of Utrecht. The British wanted to secure the loyalties of the French settlers of the newly created colony of Nova Scotia. So they demanded an oath of loyalty to the British Crown. The French refused, offering instead to swear their neutrality. That worked for a while, but eventually Governor Cornwallis again asked them to swear their loyalty. Again they refused. British warships began to appear in Halifax Harbor in 1748. And the farmers were required to swear allegiance to the Crown and to take up arms against their fellow countrymen when Charles Lawrence took over as governor. Then, fighting broke out in the Ohio River Valley in 1754, signaling the start of the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War in Europe. And loyalty was again demanded of the French. When they refused this time, Charles Lawrence delivered his famous expulsion orders, resulting in the forced removal of all French settlers from Acadia and New Brunswick. Beginning with Beaubassin in June of 1755, the first village to experience the pain and heartbreak of deportation, and then on to Fort Beauséjour, moving methodically throughout the territory, Le Grand Dérangement began in earnest. The expulsion orders were read to all inhabitants of the area, village by village, and British warships, along with their contractors, many of whom were from Massachusetts, began, quote, clearing the whole country of bad subjects, unquote. Approximately 7,000 Acadians were deported during 1755. They were held on prison ships for several weeks before being moved to their destinations. An estimated 2,700 deportees died before reaching their destinations. Many more people died in the transition, with estimates of an additional 10,000 deaths during the winter of 1755-1756. There are estimates of 5,000 to 6,000 Acadians escaping to Quebec or hiding among their Micmac friends to avoid deportation. Smallpox took its toll among the deportees, and hundreds died when transport ships sank en route to their destination. All told, estimates of total numbers deported run to between 13,000 and 14,000, with roughly 6,500 of them coming from Acadia. Their destinations included anywhere from Massachusetts to the mid-Atlantic states to as far south as Georgia. They were not welcome wherever they found themselves ashore. One of the largest geographical areas of settlement became Louisiana, It was then under the control of Spain, and the Catholic Acadians were welcomed as settlers, especially in the Atchafalaya Basin and the prairie lands to the west. As the population of the French Canadians grew in the area and their culture became reestablished, Acadien became corrupted to become Cajun. Grand Pré, Nova Scotia is now a National Historic Site of Canada. It has been preserved as a living monument to the expulsion, complete with memorial church and a statue of Evangeline. If you're interested in local resources on Le Grand Derangement, I suggest you visit the Shrewsbury Library and ask to view the wonderful video by Lucy LeBlanc Consentino called The Acadian Diaspora. She can provide connections to the genealogy of those of us who have Acadian roots and wonderful insights to the history of that period. There is also a DNA project available wherein you can submit your DNA for comparison to an existing database of Acadians. It's tempting to try to connect the dots as we read Longfellow's poetic descriptions of the events and the geography of the travels of our romantic heroine as she searches for her beloved Gabriel. The events themselves are indeed based on historical fact. Grand Pré did exist, and still does for that matter. The village suffered the removal of its inhabitants in 1755. They were scattered far and wide, and many did find themselves in Louisiana and settle there, and can be found there even today. Lucy LeBlanc Consentino's video confirms this with exquisite detail. The route over which Evangeline traveled and the stunning geographical descriptions by Longfellow, however, were a complete fabrication of his fertile imagination. Even the grand descriptions of the shoreline of Grand Pré, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks bearded with moss of the forest primeval, can be said to be lovely and poetic, but not necessarily visually comparable to the actual shoreline in Nova Scotia as it exists. Longfellow is said to have created his heroine's travel route from a diorama that he viewed in Boston at the time he was writing Evangeline. The diorama was presented to the public in Boston and showed the natural flora and fauna of the United States from the East Coast through Middle America at that time, including the Mississippi River and points west. Longfellow used these to create his vision of what the geography of Middle America would have appeared like to Evangeline as she followed her dream. Fictional, but superbly beautiful, we see through her eyes the landscape of early American beauty in forests and trees and flowers. It is poetic license par excellence. So it is not possible to connect the dots, so to speak. But no matter. Close your eyes and let your mind fill in the route of Evangeline's travels in search of Gabriel. Let's do a brief review to catch up to the villages of Grand Pré. In Chapter 3, we were privileged to learn of the formal betrothal of Gabriel and Evangeline and the happy plans made by the families of the village to share in the excitement surrounding this auspicious occasion. We also learned of the interesting background surrounding René Leblanc, the notary, as he shared that wonderful tale of his past in times of war. The story filled in some background on the notary and his role in the fabric of the village and its people. We also discovered the ominous clouds of anxiety that arose from a mandatory meeting in the village church. Chapter 4 brought the soldiers from the warship into the village, and we heard the proclamation that announces heartbreaking news to all that they must leave. The wedding preparations were in full swing, and Michael the fiddler was playing his heart out as the villagers ultimately learned of their tragic fate and strained to contain their anger at the unfairness of it all. The betrothed lovers will have to wait as the tragedy unfolds. Tempers flared, anger showed its ugly head, physical violence erupted, and the whole mood changed from one of optimism to one of despair. It took all the skills of the village priest, Father Felician, to contain the anguish of his people. This current episode spans 2 different periods of time. It closes out the time that the villagers have remaining together in Grand Pré, part the 1st, chapter 5, and begins the time with Evangeline traveling alone in search of Gabriel, part the 2nd, chapter 1. Measure the years and the heartbreak as we listen once again to Longfellow's evocative and haunting words. Evangeline, part the 1st, chapter 5. 4 times the sun had risen and set, and now on the 5th day cheerily called the cock to the sleeping maids of the farmhouse. Soon o'er the yellow fields in silent and mournful procession came from the neighboring hamlets and farms the Acadian women, driving in ponderous wains their household goods to the seashore, pausing and looking back to gaze once more on their dwellings, ere they were shut from sight by the winding road and the woodland. Close at their sides their children ran and urged on the oxen, while in their little hands they clasped some fragments of playthings. Thus to the Gaspereau's mouth they hurried, and there on the sea beach piled in confusion lay the household goods of the peasants. All day long between the shore and the ships did the boats ply. All day long the wains came laboring down from the village. Late in the afternoon, when the sun was near to his setting, echoed far o'er the fields came the roll of drums from the churchyard. Thither the women and children thronged. On a sudden the church doors opened, and forth came the guard, and marching in gloomy procession followed the long imprisoned but patient Acadian farmers, even as pilgrims who journey afar from their homes and their country, sing as they go, and in singing forget they are weary and wayworn. So with songs on their lips the Acadian peasants descended down from the church to the shore, amid their wives and their daughters. Foremost the young men came, and raising together their voices, sang they with tremulous lips a chant of the Catholic missions. Sacred Heart of the Savior, O inexhaustible fountain, fill our hearts this day with strength and submission and patience. Then the old men, as they marched, and the women that stood by the wayside joined in the sacred psalm, and the birds in the sunshine above them mingled their notes therewith, like voices of spirits departed. Halfway down to the shore, Evangeline waited in silence, not overcome with grief, but strong in the hour of affliction. Calmly and sadly she waited until the procession approached her, and she beheld the face of Gabriel, pale with emotion. Tears then filled her eyes, and eagerly running to meet him, clasped she his hands, and laid her head on his shoulder and whispered, Gabriel, be of good cheer. For if we love one another, nothing in truth can harm us, whatever mischances may happen. Smiling, she spake these words, then suddenly paused, for her father saw she slowly advancing. Alas, how changed was his aspect. Gone was the glow from his cheek, and the fire from his eye, and his footstep heavier seemed with the weight of the heavy heart in his bosom. But with a smile and a sigh she clasped his neck and embraced him, speaking words of endearment where words of comfort availed not. Thus to the Gaspereau's mouth moved on that mournful procession. There disorder prevailed, and the tumult and stir of embarking. Busily plied the freighted boats, and in the confusion wives were torn from their husbands, and mothers, too late, saw their children left on the land, extending their arms with wildest entreaties. So unto separate ships were Basil and Gabriel carried, while in despair on the shore Evangeline stood with her father, Half the task was not done when the sun went down, and the twilight deepened and darkened around, and in haste the refluent ocean fled away from the shore and left the line of the sand beach covered with waifs of the tide, with kelp and the slippery seaweed. Farther back, in the midst of the household goods in the wagons, like to a gypsy camp or a leaguer after a battle, all escape cut off by the sea, and the sentinels near them lay encamped for the night, the houseless Arcadian farmers. Back to its nethermost caves retreated the bellowing ocean, dragging adown the beach the rattling pebbles, and leaving inland and far up the shore the stranded boats of the sailors. Then as the night descended, the herds returned from their pastures. Sweet was the moist, still air with the odor of milk from their udders. Lowing they waited, and long, at the well-known bars of the farmyard, waited and looked in vain for the voice and the hand of the milkmaid. Silence reigned in the streets. From the church no angelus sounded. Rose no smoke from the roofs, and gleamed no lights from the windows. But on the shores, meanwhile, the evening fires had been kindled, built of driftwood thrown on the sands from wrecks in the tempest. Round them shapes of gloom and sorrowful faces were gathered. Voices of women were heard, and of men, and the crying of children. Onward from fire to fire, as from hearth to hearth in his parish, wandered the faithful priest, consoling and blessing and cheering, like unto shipwrecked Paul on Melita's desolate seashore. Thus he approached the place where Evangeline sat with her father, and in the flickering light beheld the face of the old man, haggard and hollow and wan, and without either thought or emotion, even as the face of a clock from which the hands have been taken. Vainly Evangeline strove with words and caresses to cheer him, vainly offered him food, yet he moved not, he looked not, he spake not, but with a vacant stare ever glazed at the flickering firelight. Benedicite, murmured the priest in tones of compassion. More he fain would have said, but his heart was full, and his accents faltered and paused on his lips as the feet of a child on a threshold. Hushed by the scene he beholds and the awful presence of sorrow. Silently, therefore, he laid his hand on the head of the maiden, raising his eyes full of tears to the silent stars that above them moved on their way, unperturbed by the wrongs and sorrows of mortals. Then sat he down at her side, and they wept together in silence. Suddenly rose from the south a light, as in autumn the blood-red moon climbs the crystal walls of heaven, and o'er the horizon Titan-like stretches its 100 hands upon mountain and meadow, seizing the rocks and the rivers and piling huge shadows together. Broader and ever broader it gleamed on the roofs of the village, gleamed on the sky and the sea and the ships that lay in the roadstead. Columns of shining smoke uprose, and flashes of flame were thrust through their folds and withdrawn like the quivering hands of a martyr. Then, as winds seized the gleeds and the burning thatch, and uplifting, whirled them aloft through the air, at once from 100 housetops started the sheeted smoke with flashes of flame intermingled. These things beheld in dismay the crowd on the shore and on shipboard. Speechless at first they stood, then cried aloud in their anguish, "We shall behold no more our homes in the village of Grand Pré." Loud on a sudden the cocks began to crow in the farmyards, thinking the day had dawned. And anon the lowing of cattle came on the evening breeze, by the barking of dogs interrupted. Then rose a sound of dread, such as startles the sleeping encampments far in the western prairies of forests that skirt the Nebraska, when the wild horses affrighted sweep by with the speed of the whirlwind, or the loud bellowing herds of buffaloes rush to the river. Such was the sound that arose on the night as the herds and the horses broke through their folds and fences and madly rushed o'er the meadows. Overwhelmed with the sight, yet speechless, the priests and the maiden gazed on the scene of terror that reddened and widened before them. And as they turned at length to speak to their silent companion, lo, from the seat he had fallen, and stretched abroad on the seashore motionless lay his form, from which the soul had departed. Slowly the priest uplifted the lifeless head, And the maiden knelt at her father's side and wailed aloud in her terror. Then in a swoon she sank, and lay with her head on his bosom. Through the long night she lay in deep, oblivious slumber, and when she woke from the trance, she beheld a multitude near her. Faces of friends she beheld that were mournfully gazing upon her, pallid with tearful eyes and looks of saddest compassion. Still the blaze of the burning village illumined the landscape, reddened the sky overhead, and gleamed on the faces around her. And like the day of doom, it seemed to her wavering senses. Then a familiar voice she heard as it said to the people, "Let us bury him by the sea. When a happier season brings us again to our homes from the unknown land of our exile, then shall his sacred dust be piously laid in the churchyard." Such were the words of the priest. And there in haste by the seaside, having the glare of the burning village for funeral torches, but without bell or book, they buried the farmer of Grand Pré. And as the voice of the priest repeated the service of sorrow, lo, with a mournful sound, like the voice of a vast congregation, solemnly answered the sea, and mingled its roar with the dirges. 'Twas the returning tide, that afar from the waste of the ocean, with the first dawn of the day, came heaving and hurrying landward. Then recommenced once more the stir and noise of embarking. And with the ebb of the tide, the ships sailed out of the harbor, leaving behind them the dead on the shore and the village in ruins. End of the chapter. End of part the first. This is Evangeline by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and this is part the second, chapter 1. Many a weary year had passed since the burning of Grand Pré, when on the falling tide the freighted vessels departed, bearing a nation with all its household goods into exile, exile without an end, and without an example in story. Far asunder on separate coasts the Acadians landed. Scattered were they like flakes of snow when the wind from the northeast strikes aslant through the fogs that darken the banks of Newfoundland. Friendless, homeless, hopeless, they wandered from city to city, from the cold lakes of the north to sultry southern savannas, from the bleak shores of the sea to the lands where the Father of waters seizes the hills in his hands and drags them down to the ocean, deep in their sands to bury the scattered bones of the mammoth. Friends they sought, and homes, and many despairing, heartbroken, asked of the earth but a grave, and no longer a friend nor a fireside. Written their history stands on tablets of stone in the churchyards. Long among them was seen a maiden who waited and wandered, lowly and meek in spirit, and patiently suffering all things. Fair was she and young, but alas, before her extended, dreary and vast and silent, the desert of life, with its pathway marked by the graves of those who had sorrowed and suffered before her, passions long extinguished, and hopes long dead and abandoned, as the emigrant's way o'er the western desert is marked by campfires long consumed and bones that bleach in the sunshine. Something there was in her life incomplete, imperfect, unfinished, as if a morning of June with all its music and sunshine suddenly paused in the sky and, fading, slowly descended into the east again from whence it late had arisen. Sometimes she lingered in towns, till, urged by the fever within her, urged by a restless longing, the hunger and thirst of the spirit, she would commence again her endless search and endeavor. Sometimes in churchyards strayed and gazed on the crosses and tombstones, sat by some nameless grave and thought that perhaps in its bosom he was already at rest, and she longed to slumber beside him. Sometimes a rumor, a hearsay, an inarticulate whisper came with its airy hand to point and beckon her forward. Sometimes she spake with those who had seen her beloved and known him, but it was long ago, in some far-off place or forgotten.
Gabriel la jeunesse, they said. Oh, yes, we have seen him. He was with Basil, the blacksmith, and both have gone to the prairies. Coureurs de bois are they, and famous hunters and trappers. Gabriel la jeunesse, said others. Oh, yes, we have seen him. He is a voyageur in the lowlands of Louisiana. Then they would say, Dear child, why dream and wait for him longer? Are there not other youths as fair as Gabriel? Others who have hearts as tender and true, and spirits as loyal? Here is Baptiste Leblanc, the notary's son, who has loved thee many a tedious year. Come, give him thy hand, and be happy. Thou art too fair to be left to braid St. Catherine's tresses. Then would Evangeline answer, serenely but sadly, I cannot. Whither my heart has gone, there follows my hand, and not elsewhere. For when the heart goes before like a lamp and illumines the pathway, many things are made clear that else lie hidden in darkness. Thereupon the priest, her friend and father confessor, said with a smile, O daughter, thy God thus speaketh within thee. Talk not of wasted affection. Affection never was wasted. If it enrich not the heart of another, its waters returning back to the springs like the rain shall fill them full of refreshment. That which the fountain sends forth returns again to the fountain. Patience, accomplish thy labor, accomplish thy work of affection. Sorrow and silence are strong, and patient endurance is godlike. Therefore accomplish thy labor of love till the heart is made godlike, purified, strengthened, perfected, and rendered more worthy of heaven. Cheered by the good man's words, Evangeline labored and waited. Still, in her heart she heard the funeral dirge of the ocean. But with its sound there was mingled a voice that whispered, Despair not. Thus did that poor soul wander in want and cheerless discomfort, bleeding, barefooted over the shards and thorns of existence. Let me essay, O Muse, to follow the wanderer's footsteps, not through each devious path, each changeful year of existence, but as a traveler follows a streamlet's course through the valley, far from its margin at times and seeing the gleam of its water here and there in some open space and at intervals only, then drawing nearer its banks through sylvan glooms that conceal it. Though he behold it not, he can hear its continuous murmur, happy at length if he find the spot where it reaches an outlet. That's the end of part the second, chapter 1.
Thank you so much for listening. I'm Bruce Andrews, wishing you a pleasant day and the time to enjoy it to the fullest. Until next time, good day. Longfellow's Evangeline is the coming together of art and history in word and in picture. So far, we've seen 3 of those episodes. There's 2 more to go. Will Evangeline eventually find Gabriel, her lover? Will they reunite? You're going to have to stay tuned to find out.